Thank you, MMRI, for the opportunity to present at your event. And hello, everyone. I'm Aya Naseem, and I'm presenting a review of coral restoration efforts in Maldives between 1990 and 2020 by the Maldives Coral Institute. To gain an understanding of the diversity and extent of coral restoration practices and experiences across the country, we reviewed local efforts over the last 3 decades. This review is not intended to be comprehensive, and it doesn't provide guidelines on best practices for restoration, but it is meant to provide a foundation for further research to inform future projects and help develop more effective coral restoration practices in the country. Because the term restoration can be very specific, it's important to clarify what we mean by restoration in the context of this review. The Society of Ecological Restoration defines it as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. The term is sometimes used interchangeably with other terms like rehabilitation, but their definitions and goals can be different. It's quite common for coral restoration projects with a goal of restoration to achieve the described targets of rehabilitation, where the ecosystem is improved, but the recovery doesn't necessarily represent a return to pre-disturbance state. In this review, we use the term restoration broadly, where we included any project that uses direct interventions to increase coral cover, improve reef functioning, rehabilitate degraded reefs, or enhance existing reefs. The information we used for this review was from primary literature or published peer-reviewed literature, gray literature, which included content from national archives like EIAs and EMPs, as well as scientific reports. And we also used a questionnaire survey of restoration practitioners and resorts. For data analysis, since most of the information we collected was descriptive, we did qualitative analysis using summary statistics. And we used a total of 29 case studies in this review out of at least 50 coral restoration projects in the country. And the majority of these we got from gray literature, followed by surveys, which represented 31% of cases, and primary literature was only 7%. And we found that one of the biggest limitations in getting data is the lack of reporting and monitoring, where there's either a lack of reporting or a lack of both monitoring and reporting. For example, most projects hadn't been submitted to the EPA, and none of those who had submitted EIAs had later submitted monitoring reports. The majority of projects included in this review were concentrated in the central atolls, with the highest density of projects close to Mala. This distribution is determined by the high concentration of resort islands in the central atolls. And 86% of all local projects that are included in the survey were done in resorts. And you can see in the map that in purple, that it's the resorts, and in yellow, it's community islands and other. Most projects are relatively small in scale. The total restored area of half of all projects was less than 150 square meters. And the median size of coral restoration projects is 142 square meters. Large scale projects represented 16% of all projects. And the largest included in this review covered an area of 40,000 square meters of restoration area. This was also the first restoration project and was done by Clark and Edwards in 1991 at Gulifalo, 10 years after coral restoration first appeared in literature. And we found that the majority of local projects commenced within the last 5 years. 29% started between 2011 and 2015, which shows a spike in restoration projects within the last decade. This increase could be for a number of reasons, including a recent rise in the number of resorts, more awareness and expertise within the country, and also in response to reef degradation after recent bleaching events and destructive development projects. You can see that more projects commenced between 2001 and 2005 than the following years, which than the following 5 years, which suggests that restoration interventions were motivated by loss of coral during the 1998 bleaching event. The most commonly reported active restoration span was 2 years, and just 12% of 26 projects reported more than 10 years of ongoing restoration work. The overall median monitoring duration was 12 months, which is also the global median duration of monitoring in coral restoration projects, and is considered too short for providing reliable measures of success, because short duration monitoring periods show only short-term survival rates of restored coral, which might not reflect longer-term averages. The most commonly cited objectives of local projects were restoration post-disturbance, 59% of projects, and value addition, which is 45% of projects. Value addition was a common objective for tourist resorts, and it's motivated primarily by economic rather than environmental concerns, but this objective was usually stated in combination with other objectives. Value addition includes a wide range of purposes that can be from the restoration site being set up to serve purely as a standalone tourist attraction, to the restoration of degraded reefs for the purpose of increasing the house reef's attractiveness to tourists. We found that the most widely monitored parameters in local restoration projects were coral growth, which was 81% of 29 projects, and survival, 63% of projects. Other commonly monitored factors were condition, fish community, and coral benthic cover. Of the 29 projects examined, 14% had an objective of reestablishing functional, self-sustaining reef ecosystem, but only 4% monitored the appropriate metrics to assess whether this objective has been met. And so projects that only monitor for coral growth and survival won't be able to reliably assess whether the project meets restoration objectives like reestablishing a functional, self-sustaining reef ecosystem. The methods we looked at, broadly categorized as direct transplantation, involving transplantation of coral colonies or fragments without a nursery phase, coral gardening, which involves transplantation with an intermediate coral nursery phase, substratum addition, where artificial reefs are created for attaching and growing coral on, and usually includes a nursery phase. Substratum stabilization, which aims to stabilize loose rubble that gets in the way of settlement and growth of coral. And substratum enhancement, where artificial reef is enhanced with electrical current. The most commonly used method in local restoration projects was coral gardening with the nursery phase, where coral fragments are grown in nurseries before transplanting, which can include rebar frames, PVC pipes, line or rope, and cement plugs. Substrate addition was also a widely used method, where coral is propagated and grown on artificial reef structures or transplanted onto artificial reef structures after a nursery phase. 90% of all 29 projects included in this review included a nursery phase. For attachment of corals, the majority of projects used rebar frames for at least one of their phases, either as nursery beds or for creating artificial reefs. Most coral fragments were attached to substrate or artificial reef using cable ties, and to plugs or reef substrate with epoxy or glue. 38% of projects reported using either fishing line or rope to grow fragments in their nurseries. Corals used for restoration were mostly sourced from a combination of corals of opportunity and fragment transplants from donor colonies of nearby reefs. Corals of opportunity are corals under threat that would likely not survive without intervention. 86% of 29 corals of local restoration projects became self-sufficient after nurseries were established. The survival of coral transplants in local restoration projects was high, with an average survival rate of 78.1% over the duration of monitoring, which varied among projects, but the median length of monitoring was 12 months. This is higher than the global average survival rate of 69% and substantially higher than survival rates reported in terrestrial ecological restoration studies, which are generally lower than 50%. And this is within the same time frame. 42% of projects reported a high 90 to 100% survival rate. The average survival rate for most commonly used method of restoration, coral gardening, was 89.3% across the 9 projects which used this method. In projects that used artificial reefs, the average survival rate is 60.3%. And we couldn't reliably compare the available data on growth rates because of differing monitoring frequencies and monitoring durations across projects, and also because of inconsistencies in methods used for growth rate measurement. For example, some measured linear growth and others measured diameter, branches, or height. So we used descriptive accounts to compare growth rate trends in relation to restoration method or growth. And a significant trend we found is that 70% of projects that grew corals on ropes and lines reported substantially higher growth rates when compared to either the usually reported growth rate for that specific species or the growth rates of corals in these projects using other attachment methods. The average survival rate of coral grown on rope is 88.7%, which is higher than the average survival rate across all projects, which was 78.05. There are mentions in obtained surveys that the faster growth rates on lines and ropes are also only seen in specific species of corals, which suggests that different species may fare better under different rearing methods. And we found that bleaching levels are quite varied across projects with no significant trends. Bleaching recovery timescales were not available, but 33% of projects that reported bleaching had recovery rates ranging between 71 to 80%. Again, in projects that use ropes and lines, 40% of projects reported that bleaching was substantially lower than corals grown using other methods in the same project. This comparative tolerance to bleaching in rope and line grown corals is most likely from better water flow, cooler water from the position of the lines in the water column. This is quite unclear, but at least 81 species of corals across 29 genera have been used in local projects. The number of species is a conservative value because some projects only list the genus, and for example, might say we used 5 species of Acropora without specifying the species name. The most widely used genus in local restoration projects was Acropora, represented in 89% of projects, followed by Passilopora, 81% of projects. And Acropora humilis was the species that was used the most and was used in 32% of projects. So what did we learn from this review? Globally, the key issues in coral restoration are seen as being lack of clear objectives, lack of appropriate monitoring and reporting, poor project design, and limitations in scaling up of projects, both spatially and temporally. These problems are also reflected in local projects, along with issues that are more specific to Maldives. A notable Maldives-specific issue is that such a high proportion of projects were carried out in resort islands, with the commonly observed objective of value addition, which could lead to a range of issues that might affect the quality and scope of restoration. These include effects that could arise when motivations for projects are driven by commercial concerns rather than social or ecological ones. Also, Maldivian resorts are isolated from local communities and are not generally accessible to local population. So the high concentration of restoration efforts in resort islands means that the local island communities that rely on coral reefs and who will be the most affected by reef degradation in the long term are for the most part disconnected from the restoration work that's being carried out in the country. The majority of local restoration projects monitored biological metrics like coral survival and growth, and rarely looked at ecological parameters, regardless of stated objectives. It would be important to include environmental and ecological metrics in monitoring programs to make a better assessment of restoration success. Monitoring social and economic outcomes are also necessary to assess outcomes of stated objectives like value addition and for assessing ecosystem benefits, as well as the associated effects on reef reliant communities. Lack of standardized monitoring periods and methods made it difficult to make reliable comparisons between project outcomes and to assess relative success. So it is important for restoration projects to follow standardized monitoring methods and for also for monitoring programs to include a wider range of metrics. Further studies into the developing coral gardening methods in combination with nursery rearing of corals on ropes and lines, and also studies into species specific survival, growth, and bleaching rates across methods would also allow for better planning of restoration projects. Decision-making processes for coral restoration efforts have to consider the importance of factoring in changes to the climate and make sure the importance of addressing these issues is not overlooked. And the success of restoration projects is also dependent on reducing local stresses like destruction from coastal development projects. And these issues have to be addressed for restoration efforts to be justified. To make sure restoration efforts are successful, we need to develop a holistic approach that combines monitoring and research, protection and conservation, management and policy, as well as community and society. In the context of Maldives, a country with such an absolute dependence on coral reefs, social and ecological resilience go hand in hand and can only be effectively strengthened together. So as threats to coral continue to increase and live coral cover continues to decline, we need innovative solutions to improve restoration efficiency and conserve biodiversity, while also strengthening the resilience of island communities that rely on coral reefs. So thank you for listening. And also I'd like to thank everyone who's listening who participated in the survey.